Hello and welcome to the video of my procrastination. Thank you for assisting with my procrastination. It's a busy day. I've got about 100 things I need to do, but half of them are online and I'm sick of the computer, and the other half are outside and it's winter and it's cold. So, what am I going to do but a book review? Thank you for your assistance in this matter. Now, a few days ago I was watching a YouTube video by the wonderful Jules Burt. He was talking about Penguin editions of George Orwell, and I'll try and link that below if I can find it. I should be able to find it. But while he was talking about Orwell, I remembered their essays. George Orwell is known to all and sundry for 1984 and for Animal Farm, his great big science fiction, dystopian, futuristic novels. And I've read them too, and being literate, I do enjoy them, and I like what they're doing. But if I'm going to be totally honest, as a youngster, as a teenager, when I was first encountering George Orwell, I didn't like either of them very much. They're both books that you need to have explained to you, I feel, to really get full enjoyment out of them. On the other hand, Orwell's essays, which were always around the house, I did enjoy. I'm not saying I understood them particularly well, because I'm pretty sure I didn't. And I'm not sure that even today I fully understand them. Each one of these essays has got beautiful writing, spectacular writing, and it's chock-a-block full of ideas and concepts. And yeah, if you've only ever read Orwell for his great classics, 1984 Animal Farm, I reckon read a couple of his essays as well. Now, here I've got a book from my parents which shows clear signs of having been rained on and kept in a back pocket while travelling or similar. This is a numbered edition 1185, if you care about that sort of thing or understand it. And it contains 6 essays, all of which I'm pretty sure I have read in the past, but not recently. So when I reread The Prevention of Literature last night, the night before, recently at night, it was like a new one. Now, older book here, it looks very much as this selection first printed in Penguin Books 1957, and I think this might be a 57 edition. It's a bit creaky, but not too bad. I'm not sure where it was published. They were clearly published in England, but these ones were also published in Canada, Australia, and South Africa, all places my parents visited, so it could be from either one. If you know, let me do by all means tell me. What it doesn't have is it doesn't have that little boomerang on the spine that they used to add to some Penguin Australian editions, and we've got this fantastic portrait on the back. Not the sort of portrait you'd ever see published on the back of a novel these days, but I really enjoy it. Okay, so The Prevention of Literature is not a large essay, but I found it kind of breathtaking. I thoroughly enjoyed every second of the reading of it. It was allegedly, and according to the internet, first published in 1946, and it's concerned with the freedom of thought and expression. There's no doubt about that. He really beleaguers his point. Now, beleaguered. Beluga, the whale. Sorry. Now, this is published by Penn, and I don't know what the Penn Club is, but Orwell starts off with a description of having attended a meeting by the Penn Club on the 300-year anniversary of Milton's, I can't pronounce that, Areopagitica. Look, it was in Paradise Lost. I read Paradise Lost. What can I tell you? And this meeting was allegedly of the topic in defense of freedom of the press. Now, he starts off his essay, which is not long. I think it's only 15 or 16 pages long, with an impassioned, very literary discussion of the fact that this meeting, which was meant to be titled In Defense of Freedom of the Press, it doesn't actually talk about the freedom of the press at all. Most of the speakers, he claims, talking about the defense of Russian purges, Support of communism apparently was high on the agenda, the moral liberty to discuss sex in literature, but political liberty was not mentioned. And he clearly found that distressing. Now, I'm going to read a lot of bits from this. This is in the public domain, so I can't see that being a problem. And in fact, if you would like to read this essay, it's available for free online from the Orwell Foundation, and it is also available free online from Project Gutenberg and I think a few other places. Anyhow, what really stands out here is the literature, and having read a few or listened to a few books recently where the literature clearly wasn't the main objective, I was really enjoying and reveling in the beauty of the language that's used. One gets the sense of an author who's there to write because language is a large part of what they're all about. For example, it follows that any struggle against the abuse of language is a sentimental archaism, like preferring candles to electric light or hansom cabs to aeroplanes. It is clear that the decline of a language must ultimately have political and economic causes. It is not due simply to the bad influence of this or that individual writer. I don't know, there's just something about this writing that is both exciting and cozy and thoroughly enjoyable, at least to this reader. Okay, so his defense of freedom of the press, his deriding the lack of speakers actually talking on the topic is quite vehement here, and there is a footnote at some stage where he says it might just be that he was there on a bad day. There we go, on page 147 he has a footnote about that. But basically, the talk is, to some extent, I think, a pretext for Orwell to discuss various things that are near and dear to his heart: attacks on freedom of thought, the enemies of intellectual liberty. And this is a surprisingly contemporary essay, written so long ago. There are so many of the things that he's talking about that could very, very much apply to modern literature, modern news affairs, and modern press. I am not always a fan of the press. So he says that the immediate enemies of treason, of freedom of thought in England are the concentration of the press in a very few hands. 2026, Murdoch-Packer, just saying. There's a monopoly of radio, bureaucracy, and the unwillingness of the public to buy books. Now, we're talking about something... Sorry. We're talking about something that was published decades ago, and yet here we are again. Once again, it's all over YouTube and all through other social media. It's like, oh, why aren't people buying books? For decades, this has been the same point of discussion, apparently. So, he talks about conservatives and Catholics and how one needed to defend freedom against them. Political freedom of information is certainly something that is coming up a lot recently. He then talks about the Ukrainian famine, which I've got to admit that I've never heard of, and the Spanish Civil War, which I've got to admit I know very little about, except that it happened. And he also talks about Poland. And he talks about those as a frame of reference because the prevailing orthodoxy among press and writers only allows them to represent one part of it. He then goes into a long discussion of how the difference between freedom of the press to write what they want and believe to be true, the freedom of a writer, an author, maker of literature to write what they believe to be true, and how that affects either of them. So he talks about freedom of the press when there's a complex ideology that only allows you to praise or describe one side positively, and the other side must also always be the bad guy. That is certainly happening throughout the world today, where certain groups can be attacked with no repercussion, and other groups as sacrosanct no matter what they do. I do try to keep politics down on this channel, but that's certainly a truth in many countries today, in many different ways. And that is the point that Orwell is making here. He's making the point that for the press to be honest to what they know is a freedom of the press that is not then, apparently, a liberty that they have. He also talks about the ways in which poetry can survive under totalitarianism, whereas prose writers are crippled by the destruction of intellectual liberty. And he talks a lot about this difference between poetry and prose and the freedoms that both need. And then he goes into totalitarianism quite a bit. So, 15 pages. I could probably talk about this for 15 minutes, and I'm sure that people have talked about it for 15 hours. There is a huge amount of information in here, and I've got to be honest, given when it was written, a lot of the socio-political environment in which it was written is a bit opaque to me, which makes it even more amazing that so much of it feels breathtakingly and brilliantly relevant. So on page 171, he talks about a prediction of modern social media and its effects on literature. Essentially, that is what it is. I mean, he was writing about his modern effects, but it could be considered the same today. Let's see if I can flick through and find it. Page 171, you say? That doesn't seem likely. There we go. Okay, let's start with this one since I found it first. It would probably not be beyond human ingenuity to write books by machinery. Hello, AI! And this is from the 40s. You can see how he came to write 1984 and Animal Farm throughout this. Animal Farm clearly is more his opinions about communism and totalitarianism, especially totalitarianism, and how it can evolve from communism and other political systems. But 1984 is throughout this, and let's never forget that his working title was 1948. Okay. The destruction of intellectual liberty cripples the journalist, the sociological writer, the historian, the novelist, the critic, and the poet in that order. In the future, it is possible that a new kind of literature, not involving individual feeling or truthful observation, may arise, but no such thing is at present imaginable. Yes. Okay, let's see if I can find... Of course, print will continue to be used, and it is interesting to speculate what kinds of reading matter would survive in a rigidly totalitarian society. He also talks about prose and what particular political structures it doesn't come out of. And one of the ones that he talks about specifically is communism, and how the prose that comes out of it is limited to what comes out of... Let's not chew that. Chewing glass is bad. Sorry. And I think we can see that a little bit in science fiction that came out of Soviet era. Some of it did. Roadside Picnic, for example. But Roadside Picnic and other works by the Strugatsky brothers stand out all the more because there's so little competition coming from the same area that I know of. Or at least it's been translated. So here he says, probably novels and stories will be completely superseded by film and radio productions. Or perhaps some kind of low-grade sensational fiction will survive, produced by a sort of conveyor belt process that reduces human initiative to the minimum. Utterly prescient. And he even goes down and mentions the Disney films, for example, are produced by what is essentially a factory process. The work being done partly mechanically and partly by teams of artists who have to subordinate the individual style. Well, and the interesting thing today is that we would look at most of those original Disney films that he must be talking about here and think, wow, they were so individualized, so artist-driven compared to what we're getting today. Anyhow, brilliant discussion of political motivations and literature and free speech, astonishingly contemporary. I challenge anyone to read that particular essay and not see how it's relevant to 2026 as much so as it would have been to the 1940s when it was written. As a final comment, I'm going to throw this out there in case any of you know. On page 173, he describes Alexei Tolstoy as a literary prostitute, which is fascinating. I mean, I'm not a big Tolstoy fan, but I don't know why the 40s would have regarded him as a literary prostitute. Anyhow, on that high note, thank you very much for watching. If you are indeed still watching, a review that is very different to most of the ones on my channel. And so, yes, read good books, short stories, essays, or anything else you like. Just read good stuff, not that mechanical stuff at all. Bye.